$9 billion. That's how much Elizabeth Holmes convinced the world her company was worth. And every single blood test it performed was a lie. January 2022. A 37-year-old woman in a gray suit sat in a federal courtroom in San Jose. The jury had reached a verdict. Guilty on 4 counts of fraud. The woman who was once the world's youngest self-made female billionaire was going to prison. But how did she get here? How did a Stanford dropout convince some of the most powerful people in America that she had revolutionized medicine when her technology never actually worked? The story begins in 2003 on the Stanford campus. Elizabeth Holmes was a 19-year-old sophomore studying chemical engineering. She had an idea that would change everything, or so she claimed. What if you could run hundreds of medical tests from just a few drops of blood? No more painful needle draws. No more waiting weeks for results. A tiny finger prick could detect cancer, diabetes, heart disease, all in minutes, all from a device small enough to fit in your home. Holmes pitched her idea to her professor, Channing Robertson. He was so impressed that he agreed to become her advisor. She dropped out of Stanford that same semester to pursue her vision full-time. She called her company Theranos, a combination of therapy and diagnosis. In the beginning, she raised $6 million from venture capitalists who believed in the dream. The problem was, the technology didn't exist. For the next decade, Theranos engineers tried to make Holmes's vision a reality. They built device after device. The Edison. The Mini Lab. Each one was supposed to revolutionize blood testing. Each one failed to deliver accurate results. But Elizabeth Holmes had a solution. If the technology didn't work, she would pretend it did. Holmes was a master of performance. She dropped her voice to a deep baritone. She never blinked during conversations. She wore the same black turtleneck every day, a deliberate imitation of Steve Jobs, whom she idolized. Investors and journalists were mesmerized. Here was a young woman claiming to democratize healthcare. She appeared on Forbes and Fortune covers. She was profiled by The New Yorker. She spoke at TED conferences about her mission to change the world. What if when someone you love gets sick, you could have done something about it sooner? That was her pitch. And it was incredibly effective. She assembled a board of directors that read like a who's who of American power. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. George Shultz, another former Secretary of State. General James Mattis, who would later become Secretary of Defense. Former senators. Former cabinet members. None of them had any expertise in medical technology. But they gave Theranos something money couldn't buy: credibility. If Henry Kissinger believed in this company, who would dare question it? In 2013, Theranos announced a partnership with Walgreens worth an estimated $140 million. The pharmacy chain would install Theranos wellness centers in stores across America. Patients could walk in, get a finger prick, and receive results for over 200 tests. There was just one problem. The Edison devices in those wellness centers couldn't actually perform most of those tests. Theranos was secretly sending the majority of samples to be processed on traditional machines, the same technology they claimed to have made obsolete. And the tests that were run on Theranos devices? The results were wildly inaccurate. Patients were being told they had serious medical conditions when they didn't. Others were told they were healthy when they weren't. Internally, Theranos was in chaos. Engineers who raised concerns were fired. Quality control staff who questioned results were silenced. The company had created a culture where loyalty to Elizabeth Holmes mattered more than patient safety. Sunny Balwani, Holmes' secret boyfriend and the company's COO, ruled by fear. Employees described him screaming at anyone who delivered bad news. One former scientist said the lab felt like a war zone. By 2014, Theranos had raised over $700 million from investors. Its valuation peaked at $9 billion. Elizabeth Holmes owned over 50% of the company, making her worth $4.5 billion on paper, the youngest self-made female billionaire in history. But the house of cards was about to collapse. And it started with a single phone call. John Carreyrou was an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal. In early 2015, he received a tip from a former Theranos employee. The technology didn't work. The company was lying to patients and investors. Carreyrou began investigating. What he found was staggering. Theranos had never published its technology in peer-reviewed journals. It had never allowed independent verification of its claims. And former employees described a systematic culture of deception. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published its first Theranos expose copyright. The article revealed that the company was using its Edison devices for only a small fraction of its tests. The rest were being run on commercial machines from competitors. Holmes went on the offensive. She appeared on CNBC, on Mad Money with Jim Cramer, defending her company. "This is what happens when you work to change things," she said. "First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, then you change the world." But the evidence kept mounting. Walgreens suspended its partnership. The FDA inspected Theranos labs and found severe deficiencies. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services threatened to ban Holmes from running a lab for 2 years. In 2016, Theranos voided 2 years of blood test results affecting tens of thousands of patients who had made medical decisions based on faulty data. The company that promised to revolutionize healthcare had instead put patients at risk. The board members who had lent their names to Theranos began resigning. The investors who had poured hundreds of millions into the company demanded answers. The story of Elizabeth Holmes was no longer about innovation, it was about deception. In March 2018, the SEC charged Elizabeth Holmes with massive fraud. She had raised more than $700 million from investors through an elaborate, years-long fraud in which she exaggerated or made false statements about the company's technology, business, and financial performance. Holmes settled with the SEC without admitting wrongdoing. But federal prosecutors weren't finished. 3 months later, she was indicted on criminal charges, 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The trial began in September 2021, delayed by the pandemic. Holmes took the stand in her own defense. Her strategy was stunning. She blamed everything on Sunny Balwani. She claimed Balwani had controlled her. That he had abused her emotionally and sometimes physically. That she had believed Theranos technology worked because he told her it did. She portrayed herself as a victim, not a perpetrator. The jury didn't fully buy it. In January 2022, they found Holmes guilty on 4 counts of wire fraud and conspiracy related to defrauding investors. She was acquitted on charges related to defrauding patients. In November 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. The judge said the scheme was not just about money, it was about fame, about being seen as a revolutionary. Sunny Balwani was tried separately and convicted on all 12 counts he faced. He was sentenced to nearly 13 years in prison. So what can we learn from the Theranos disaster? First, credentials and famous names don't equal due diligence. Theranos' board was filled with political heavyweights, but none of them understood the technology they were endorsing. They trusted Holmes because of her charisma, not because they verified her claims. Second, disruption requires proof. Holmes talked constantly about revolutionizing healthcare, but she never published peer-reviewed research. She never allowed independent testing. Real innovation welcomes scrutiny. Fraud hides from it. Third, culture reflects leadership. Theranos created an environment where employees who raised concerns were punished, not rewarded. When truth-telling becomes career suicide, lies become institutionalized. Fourth, the fake-it-till-you-make-it ethos has limits. In Silicon Valley, there's a culture of overpromising and assuming the technology will catch up. But healthcare isn't an app. When lives are at stake, pretending your product works isn't disruption, it's dangerous. The Theranos story is ultimately about the gap between vision and reality. Elizabeth Holmes had a compelling vision, one that investors, journalists, and powerful people desperately wanted to believe. But vision without substance is just a story. And in the end, stories have consequences. Patients made medical decisions based on faulty tests. Investors lost hundreds of millions of dollars. Employees who knew the truth lived in fear. All because one person believed that appearing to change the world was the same as actually doing it. Elizabeth Holmes entered prison in May 2023. She is scheduled for release in 2032. Her story serves as a warning. In the age of disruption and billion-dollar valuations, the most important question remains the oldest one. Does it actually work? If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe and hit the bell for more business case studies and industry analysis.